لجمعيات خيرية وشركات تجارية وأيضا محال تجارية ويعني عيادات لأطباء ومكاتب لمحامين، بما أن هذه المنطقة هي المنطقة مركز البلد من الناحية الاقتصادية والتجارية، فهذه الشرائح كانت متواجدة في هذه البناية، وبالتالي هذا التدمير يعتبر تدميرا اقتصاديا كبيرا وورقة ضغط إضافية تشحذها قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي والمستوى السياسي الإسرائيلي في وجه، أو تشحذها في وجه الفصائل الفلسطينية بعد أن أتت على برج هنادي السكني ليلة أمس ودمرته بالكامل، وأيضا دمرت إلى حد كبير برج ضبيط أو برج الجوهرة على مفترق ضبيط المتاخم للبناية التي نتواجد فيها. وبالتالي هو مسلسل حرب البنايات والأبراج السكنية والمدنية في قطاع غزة بدأته قوات الاحتلال مبكرا. يعني.
أرجو أن تبقى معنا. ونتحول الآن إلى الياس كرام في جنوب عسقلان. عادة حينما تلجأ فصائل فلسطينية إلى رشقات صاروخية، هل تشعر بها إسرائيل فورا؟ هل تتصدى لها هذه القبة الحديدية التي تتحدث عنها؟ يعني هل لديك معلومات في ماذا كانت قد صدرت عن تصديها لهذه الرشقات قبل قليل كما قال مراسلنا في غزة؟
نعم بالفعل كانت قبل قليل 3 أو 4 رشقات متتالية استطعنا أن نشاهدها تنطلق من داخل قطاع غزة، ومن هنا من فوقنا اعترضت القبة الحديدية العشرات من هذه الصواريخ، بعضها كان موجها إلى بئر السبع باتجاه الشرق، وأخرى اتجهت شمالا فطالت مدينة عسقلان، حيث نبلغ عن إصابة مباشرة في أحد المباني هناك، دون الحصول بعد حتى هذه الساعة على معلومات وافية حول ما سببه هذا الصاروخ الذي أصاب مبنى في عسقلان في هذه الرشقة الأخيرة. الرشقات القوية أيضا طالت مدينة أسدود وكذلك مدينة تل أبيب الكبرى، بمعنى مدينة تل أبيب وكل الضواحي الجنوبية تحديدا في هذه الرشقة كانت ضمن الأهداف التي استهدفتها هذه الرشقات الصاروخية. ونشير في هذا السياق إلى أن مدينة حيفا وبلديتها بالتحديد قد قررت فتح الملاجئ اعتبارا من الساعة الأخيرة، على اعتبار أن هنالك ربما مخاوف في داخل إسرائيل من أن تقوم فصائل الفلسطينية بتوسيع دائرة استهدافها للمدن الإسرائيلية. كما أن بلدية إيلات على البحر الأحمر، وهي تبعد حوالي 200 إلى 250 كيلومترا عن حدود قطاع غزة، قد أيضا قررت فتح الملاجئ العامة هناك. ليس واضحا بعد السبب الذي دفع بلدية إيلات إلى فتح الملاجئ حقيقة، وهي لم تتعرض على الأقل في السابق إلى قصف من جانب الفصائل الفلسطينية، لكن ربما أن هناك خشية من جانب أجهزة الأمن الإسرائيلية إلى دخول جهات أخرى على خط هذا الصراع، لا سيما وأن إسرائيل لديها حساب مفتوح مع إيران بسبب ما تقوم به من استهداف للبوارج الإيرانية في البحر الأحمر، وهناك حساب مفتوح أيضا بسبب ما تستهدفه من مواقع تابعة لها على الأراضي السورية. وكانت إسرائيل عبرت في الماضي عن خشيتها من أن تقوم إيران ربما من اليمن بإطلاق صواريخ مجنحة بمقدورها أن تصل إلى مدينة إيلات. لذلك ليس واضحا بعد السبب الذي دفع تحديدا مدينة إيلات على البحر الأحمر إلى فتح الملاجئ. ربما يكون هذا ضمن إطار الاستعداد العام في الجبهة الداخلية الإسرائيلية، تحسبا من أن تكون لدى الفصائل الفلسطينية القدرة أيضا على تسديد ضربات صاروخية لمدينة إيلات الواقعة على البحر الأحمر، والتي تبعد نحو 220 كيلومترا عن حدود قطاع غزة. أو ربما تكون لدى إسرائيل وأجهزتها الأمنية خشية من أن تكون هناك جهات أخرى قد تدخل على خط هذه المواجهة كإيران، الذي أشرت أنها لديها حساب مفتوح أيضا مع إسرائيل فيما يتعلق بالهجمات
في خبر عاجل
على البوارج الإيرانية.
صفارات الإنذار الآن تدوي وسط النقب وعسقلان وتل أبيب وبئر السبع وغوش دان. أيضا كتائب القسام قالت قصفنا عسقلان ونيتفوت وسديروت ب130 صاروخ كرد أولي على اغتيال ثلة من قادتنا. هذا ربما تأكيد لما قاله نتنياهو من أنه تم اغتيال قادة كبار في القسام. تفضل.
نعم، وهذا عمليا ما نقلته وسائل إعلام إسرائيلية عن مسؤولين إسرائيليين، قولهم بأن ثمة هناك خشية لدى المسؤولين في إسرائيل من أن يكون هنالك رد من جانب الفصائل الفلسطينية على عملية الاغتيال التي طالت 4 من كبار قادة حركة حماس العسكريين اليوم. ولذلك هذا ما يفسر فتح الملاجئ في مدينة إيلات وفي مدينة حيفا، ذلك أن لدى إسرائيل المعلومات ولدى فصائل الفلسطينية القدرة أيضا على بلوغ أهداف في مدينة حيفا أو على الأقل في الأطراف الجنوبية للمدينة. ولذلك إسرائيل استبقت رد الفصائل الفلسطينية، ربما وجهت تعليماتها إلى هذه المدن حيفا وإيلات إلى فتح الملاجئ العامة، ربما لتوسيع دائرة الاستهداف المتوقع في الساعات القليلة القادمة. وبالفعل نحن استطعنا أن نرصد من هنا من حيث نقف جنوب عسقلان رشقات صاروخية كبيرة متتالية، وهذا يفسر ربما أيضا إرباك القبة الحديدية، هذه المنظومة التي يبدو أنها فشلت في التصدي لبعض الصواريخ تحديدا في مدينة عسقلان، حيث يقول شهود عيان إنهم رأوا صواريخ تصيب مبان في داخل المدينة وبعد فشل المنظومة الحديدية في اعتراضها.
هل كان لهذه الصواريخ أي آثار على الأرض تدميرية كبيرة مثلا؟
لم نبلغ بعد حقيقة عن ذلك، لكن شهود عيان قالوا بأن هنالك إصابات مباشرة في مبان في عسقلان. نحن نشاهد بعض الأدخنة التي ربما تنبعث من الأطراف الجنوبية، ابقوا معي قليلا، الأطراف الجنوبية لمدينة عسقلان. يبدو أنها ربما تكون ناجمة عن أثار بعض الصواريخ التي سقطت في المدينة أو في أطرافها الجنوبية على أقل تقدير، لأن المنطقة الجنوبية لعسقلان هي المنطقة التي تشهد أكثر الهجمات الصاروخية الآتية من قطاع غزة في الأيام الأخيرة، بالإضافة طبعا إلى مدينة أزدود في الشمال.
ابقى معنا الياس كرام. في عسقلان
هنالك الآن صفارات إنذار، هنالك صافرات إنذار الآن في شمال قطاع غزة في البلدات الإسرائيلية الواقعة إلى شمال قطاع غزة. نستطيع أن نسمع دويها الآن في منطقة ياد مردخاي التي تبعد عنا أقل من كيلومتر واحد، وكذلك في المنطقة الجنوبية لمدينة عسقلان. إذن رشقات صاروخية متتالية تربك كما يبدو، كما حدث بالأمس أيضا، منظومة القبة الحديدية التي يبدو أنها فشلت في اعتراض بعض من هذه المقذوفات الصاروخية. وهنالك أيضا حديث عن إصابة في مدينة سديروت الإسرائيلية الواقعة إلى الشمال.
طيب أرجو أن تبقى معنا الياس في عسقلان. نتحول الآن إلى
هذا القصف أيضا.
شيرين أبو عاقلة في يافا، هل من تطورات في يافا شيرين؟
نعم، هو يمكن الحديث عن مجمل الوضع في البلدات العربية في داخل الخط الأخضر ومن بينها يافا. ربما في المقطع الذي نقف فيه يمكن ملاحظة الحواجز التي نصبتها الشرطة الإسرائيلية لمنع تحركات المركبات، ونصبت هذه الحواجز على عدة مداخل لمدينة يافا، كما يبدو لمنع وصول المواطنين الفلسطينيين والعرب، وذلك كما يبدو استعدادا لمزيد من المظاهرات التي يتوقع وتمت الدعوة إليها في العديد من البلدات العربية داخل الخط الأخضر. منذ أيام، حوالي 4 أيام، شهدنا انطلاق مظاهرات ومواجهات عنيفة بين المواطنين الفلسطينيين العرب داخل الخط الأخضر وما بين الشرطة الإسرائيلية، وذلك بدأت احتجاجا على ما تقوم به قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي من انتهاكات داخل مدينة القدس والتصعيد وعمليات الاقتحام التي عاشها المسجد الأقصى المبارك، إضافة إلى الأوضاع التي كانت سائدة والتهديدات للعائلات الفلسطينية في حي الشيخ جراح. ومن ثم تطورت الأوضاع في هذه البلدات وبعض المدن العربية المختلطة مثل مدينة يافا، تطورت أيضا الأوضاع فيها إلى مواجهات. هذا أحد الحواجز التي نصبت هنا على مداخل مدينة يافا. أيضا أستطيع أن أشاهد من بعيد وصول مزيد من كما يبدو القوات للشرطة الإسرائيلية استعدادا للمسيرات المنتظرة. متوقع في الساعة 9 أو 9:30 بالتوقيت المحلي أن تبدأ وتنطلق هذه التظاهرات. أصعب الأوضاع هي كانت خلال الأيام الأخيرة في مدينة اللد التي أعلنت فيها حالة الطوارئ، واليوم أعلن نتنياهو بأن مدينة اللد سوف تخضع لحظر تجوال، بمعنى منذ اعتبارا من الساعة 8 بعد حوالي نصف ساعة من الآن أو أقل سيبدأ فرض حظر التجوال على مدينة اللد، وذلك على خلفية التوتر الكبير الذي شهدته هذه المدينة بين المواطنين الفلسطينيين العرب هنا في مدينة اللد ومع أعداد من المستوطنين أو المواطنين الإسرائيليين الذين يسكنون هناك، والتي أدت إلى استشهاد شاب فلسطيني من مدينة اللد قبل يومين. تم اعتقال مطلقي النار عليه، ولكن حتى في هذه الأثناء هناك عمليات تحريض يقول الفلسطينيون والمواطنون العرب ضدهم من قبل الإسرائيليين ومن قبل المسؤولين الإسرائيليين، وصلت إلى حد الدعوات إلى الإفراج عن المتهمين بقتل الشاب العربي في مدينة اللد. قبل قليل بلغنا بأن هناك مواجهات أيضا تجددت في مدينة اللد، وكان هناك اقتحام لبيت العزاء لهذا الشاب الفلسطيني. يوم أمس أيضا في العديد من المدن والبلدات العربية كانت هناك مواجهات، سواء في مناطق الجليل أو هنا في يافا أو في مناطق المثلث أو حتى في مناطق النقب. هناك احتجاجات واسعة من المواطنين العرب الذين يعيشون داخل إسرائيل ضد الشرطة الإسرائيلية وضد التصعيد العسكري الإسرائيلي الذي يشهده قطاع غزة. أجواء متوترة في مختلف البلدات. نقلت بعض الوسائل بأنه ربما هذه المرة الأولى التي تفرض فيها عملية حظر تجوال على مدينة عربية، وسمعنا أيضا بأن هناك توجه ربما لإعلان مماثل قد يكون في مدينة عكا. الآن تشاهدون نحن في مدينة يافا، ربما هذا وقت الإفطار، الشوارع شبه فارغة إلا من قوات الشرطة الإسرائيلية التي كما يبدو تنتشر وتستعد لليلة ربما تكون أيضا صعبة في هذه المدينة على خلفية التوتر في منطقة اللد. قبل قليل جاءنا بأنه الاعتقالات هناك كانت اعتقالات شملت 20 من السكان، ولكن الخطير في منطقة اللد أنه كانت هناك دعوات لمستوطنين من أنحاء من الضفة الغربية الذين قالوا أنهم سيصلون إلى مدينة اللد من أجل المساندة كما يقولون الإسرائيليين في هذه المدينة على خلفية التوتر الذي كان سائدا في هذه المدينة. وهذا يشي خاصة إذا ما علمنا بأن هؤلاء هم مسلحون، ومن أطلق النار على الشاب الفلسطيني في مدينة اللد هو إسرائيلي وليس من أفراد الأجهزة الأمنية، هو الذي قام بإطلاق النار على الشاب الفلسطيني. هذا يهدد الأوضاع كثيرا، خاصة بأن البعض دافع أن من حق الإسرائيليين، طبعا هم يصفوها بأنها عملية دفاع عن النفس، ولكن أجواء متوترة. نستطيع أن نشاهد هذا في إحدى المدن المختلطة في داخل الخط الأخضر، هذا الانتشار الواسع للشرطة الإسرائيلية، محاولة إغلاق العديد من الشوارع. الآن تشاهدون أن الشرطة الإسرائيلية تنصب سياراتها في وسط الشوارع كما يبدو لمنع التنقل بين أحياء هذه المدينة. نحن بصعوبة وصلنا ومن خلال شوارع خلفية استطعنا أن نصل إلى هذه النقطة. فيما عدا ذلك واضح بأن الشرطة الإسرائيلية هي تنتشر وتغلق العديد من هذه الشوارع في مسعى لتحول دون تمكن المواطنين الفلسطينيين كما يبدو من التجمع أو الانطلاق في مظاهرات. قبل قليل كنا نستمع إلى أحد المواطنين الفلسطينيين من مدينة يافا الذي قال بأننا سنحاول أيضا أن ننظم أنفسنا، ويبدو أن هناك أيضا خشية من كبيرة من الفلسطينيين أن تكون عليهم هجمات من قبل الإسرائيليين المستوطنين أن يقوموا بمهاجمتهم أو مهاجمة بيوتهم. إذن أجواء متوترة، ربما هذه أول مرة نشهد هذا التوتر الكبير في المدن والبلدات العربية داخل الخط الأخضر بهذا التزامن مع التصعيد العسكري الإسرائيلي ضد قطاع غزة. صحيح بأننا دوما نشعر بأن هناك تعاطف وبأن هناك مسيرات أحيانا تنطلق، ولكن هذه المرة فعلا نشعر بأن هناك أجواء متوترة جدا في جميع هذه البلدات. واليوم نتنياهو خلال تصريحاته أيضا وجه تحذيرا لما اعتبره بأنه أعمال عنف وشغب، وقال بأن إسرائيل سوف تعمل على السيطرة على هذه الأوضاع. ولكن التوتر كلما تحدثت إسرائيل عن أنها ستسيطر وبأنها ستقمع كلما زاد الغضب الشعب الفلسطيني.
طيب
وهذه
شيرين قبل أن ننتقل إلى جيفارا في رام الله للتذكير، متى ستنطلق المظاهرة في يافا؟
من المفترض أن تنطلق في حدود الساعة 9 أو 9:30 مساء في التوقيت المحلي، أي بعد حوالي ساعة ونصف أو ساعتين من الآن. هناك دعوات في أعداد كبيرة من البلدات والمدن العربية داخل الخط الأخضر لاستكمال المظاهرات، ومن بينها بطبيعة الحال هي مدينة يافا. الآن تشاهدون هذا الانتشار الكبير للشرطة الإسرائيلية. نشاهد الشرطة تمنع مرور السيارات، أيضا نشاهد عدد كما يبدو من سكان المدينة الذين تحاول الشرطة الإسرائيلية إبعادهم عن هذا المكان.
اسمحي لي أنتقل إلى جيفارا المديري في رام الله. كان هناك بيان صدر من رئاسة الوزراء الفلسطينية هذا اليوم، هل لك أن تجملي لنا ما الذي قاله رئيس الوزراء هذا اليوم؟ جيفارا.
رئيس الحكومة الفلسطينية محمد شتي أكد بأن فشل إسرائيل والاحتلال في مخططاته في مدينة القدس دفعه إلى شن عدوان دموي حسب وصفه على قطاع غزة، وبأن هدم البيوت، حصار غزة بالأسلاك الشائكة، حصار القدس بالجدار العازل، هدم المنازل، إخلاء المواطنين، حي الشيخ جراح أدى إلى هذا الانفجار، وبأن إسرائيل صدرت أزمتها السياسية الداخلية بكل ما فيها من مكونات إلى قيامها بعدوان دموي حسب وصفه على قطاع غزة. إذن هو يجمل 3 أسباب لماذا قامت إسرائيل بهذا العدوان على غزة، وهذا يعكس وحدة حال الفلسطينيين في كل أماكن تواجدهم سياسيا وطنيا وشعبيا. رئيس الحكومة أيضا أكد بأنه بإعاز من الرئيس الفلسطيني الحكومة تعمل على كافة الجبهات الآن، خاصة وهو الأمر الأهم أن معابر قطاع غزة قام الاحتلال الإسرائيلي منذ بدء التصعيد في غزة بإغلاق المعابر. المصدر الرئيسي للأدوية والمعدات الطبية لغزة هو من رام الله، الآن بإغلاق المعابر وبحالة المستشفيات في غزة التي هي أصلا في وضع صعب نتيجة الظروف التي مرت بها بسبب جائحة كورونا. الآن هناك اتصالات دولية مع كافة الأطراف للتدخل، لأن غزة الآن بحاجة لأدوية ومعدات. الحكومة الآن تقوم بهذه الاتصالات. أيضا أكد بأن محكمة الجنايات الدولية أكدت بأن ما يحدث هو انتهاك للقانون الدولي، وهو ضمن الجرائم التي تسجل ضمن ما تقوم به محكمة الجنايات الدولية. إذن ملف جديد يضاف إلى الملفات الموضوعة الآن أمام محكمة الجنايات الدولية. ولكن أيضا الأنظار جمال تتجه الآن إلى مقر الرئاسة الفلسطينية. بعد أقل من ساعة ونصف سيكون هناك اجتماع على عجل دعا إليه الرئيس الفلسطيني للجنة التنفيذية لمنظمة التحرير الفلسطينية وأركان القيادة ومركزية حركة فتح. سيضع الجميع في ضوء الاتصالات المتواصلة التي يتلقاها من تحديدا قطر ومن تركيا ومصر التي تقوم الآن بالأدوار الأكبر والأهم في محاولة لوقف التصعيد
في خبر
عاجل
جفارة البيت الأبيض يقول أيضا بأن هناك مسؤولين كبار في إدارة بايدن أجروا أمس مكالمات هاتفية مع الأطراف في المنطقة، وأيضا ذكرت مصادر أن هناك مسؤول أمريكي سيتوجه إلى إسرائيل، وأنه تم تباحث في موضوع تصاعد التوتر الآن في المنطقة.
جمال
أيضا نعم. هناك خبر
جمال
آخر
هذا هو المهم. جمال هذا هو المهم فقط.
نعم
تفضل.
أيضا
المهم هو بالتحديد ما تحدثت عنه الوضع الأمريكي، بأن يوجه الرئيس الأمريكي بايدن رسالة خطية إلى الرئيس الفلسطيني، وهذه أول اتصال مباشر ما بين بايدن والرئيس الفلسطيني كان أمر هام. هذا ما سيطرحه اليوم الرئيس الفلسطيني في الاجتماع. الاتصالات مع الإدارة الأمريكية لم تتوقف، وأن يكون هناك وفق الرئاسة الفلسطينية وفق عدد من القيادات تصريح لوزير الخارجية الأمريكي بإدانة قصف واستهداف مدنيين إسرائيليين وفلسطينيين من بينهم أطفال. هذه لأول مرة جملة كهذه تخرج عن إدارة أمريكية، لم يكن متوقع. وبالتالي الآن القيادة الفلسطينية وبالاتصالات مع الأطراف الإقليمية والدولية تنظر إلى الضغط الأمريكي الذي سيمارس وإرسال مبعوث على عجل في هذا الوقت، رغم أننا لازلنا في الأيام الثلاثة الأولى للتصعيد ضد غزة، ولكن طيب. بسبب ما حدث أيضا في القدس والأحداث المتواصلة هو أيضا مهم جدا.
أشكرك. ننوه إلى الأخبار العاجلة التي ترد الآن. البيت الأبيض يقول المحادثات مستمرة بشأن التصعيد في
towards it.
How densely populated is the area around that building? I know the building will have been evacuated. There were warnings given and even warning shots fired. But how many people live around that building?
This building is in a very, very populated, densely populated area. It's in Rimal Street. It's one of the major important streets here in Gaza Strip, where so many shops are, like almost all the important shops and the residential buildings of people are. So basically destructing such a tower like Shuruk Tower, which comes exactly in the middle of the area, exactly in the middle of Rimal Street, means an entire destruction in that neighborhood. I can assure you that the aftermath of the destructing of this tower is going to be terrible, just terrible, whether because of the shops or the neighboring towers and buildings It is the highest tower in the area, and all the other towers and buildings are lower than it. But there's going to be a massive destruction for the aftermath of bringing this tower down.
That was Gazan journalist Yumna Al-Sayed reporting live there from Gaza, or she was reporting live as that explosion was happening, getting on for 90 minutes or so ago now. Farwa Kada is a social and political activist. She's also a member of the political bureau of the Palestinian People's Party. She joins us now live via Skype from occupied East Jerusalem. I saw you listening to that with great concern etched on your face. What were you thinking?
Well, actually, this is horrible. It's what's going on is against all types of humanity, and it's against nobody love to have a war. This is a war again, and I think that Netanyahu was able to indicate or to integrate Hamas into this battle. And now I'm looking at the suffering of the families, the children, and because Netanyahu was trying his best since the beginning of Ramadan to create such a huge violation in Jerusalem at the beginning. Within the march of the settlers, calling the death for the Palestinians living in East Jerusalem. So he's the one with his settlers had created all these types of violation and inequality. It's injustice, the threat of the 28 families in East Jerusalem. This is that they will be kicked out of their houses soon. So imagine all these types of threatening violation. And lately the march with flags that had shown up in East Jerusalem, also against all these types of injustice and inequality and all these things. So this is horrible. And now they're creating this. We can't, what we see. Okay, Hamas had sent its rockets, but what does its rocket did to the civilians really in reality in Israel? In the other hand, look what's going on. More than 15 children were assassinated and killed. Many were the fathers, parents, mothers. The whole families became like living in such a mess. Hundreds of injured, not only in Gaza by the bombing of Israel, but in East Jerusalem. You can't imagine what had happened in Al-Aqsa Mosque or in Sheikh Jarrah. Hundreds got injured. Many of them lost their eyes. They became disabled. And so it is inequality. So what's going on? Why there are demonstrations all over now, the West Bank and Gaza now, and also in the historical Palestine, like in what happened in Lod, what happened in Jaffa, what happened in Haifa, what happened in Akko. Why it's going on like that? Of course, we are Palestinians. They are with us, but in the other hand,
how do you see? How do you see this?
Excuse me, only in depth what's happening to them too. Yeah. What type of discrimination they are facing? Does they have their own, getting the normal rights, the equal rights between them and the Israelis? This is doesn't happen. The criminality is raising up and up day by day. So there is no stability in such country within the violation
Fadwa,
of Israel.
let me get a question in here because time is limited, I'm afraid. You suggested earlier on that you think that this current situation has been engineered by the Israeli leadership. To a certain extent, Hamas has been sucked into to the Prime Minister's plans. Where does it end?
It won't end. This is not the first time of Netanyahu government. Of course, he wasn't able to form his government, and he's running away from his, corruption files. So he started back again to creating violation here and there, everywhere, to call again for the fifth election in Israel. So the Israeli community must now admit that he's a violent personality. It's more than enough for him. What's the cause? They are calling now for the security of Israel. How come the security of Israel, all the time the international community is running back to secure Israel? But what's going on to the Palestinians? How can they manage to say to have equality between the criminals and the victims? Who's the occupier? Who's holding, since 1948 up to date, all these types of weapons, military army, settlers violation, confiscation, and so on? So there is no justice, there is no equality.
All right.
And of course,
Fadwa,
discrimination.
Many thanks indeed for being with us. Fadwa Kada there, social and political activist, also a member of the Political Bureau of the Palestinian People's Party. Just want to tell you what you're seeing here, live pictures from Sderot, where it appears that a missile has hit an apartment building. No word yet as on casualties, but there is definitely a hole in the building, as you can see, quite a large hole too. It's about 2 kilometers away from Gaza itself. I'm being told that the latest reports we have are that 3 people have been injured in that rocket attack. We've been watching rockets being launched from Gaza over the past hour after an Israeli missile strike on a building that a large tower block in Gaza City that houses media organizations along with other people who had their homes there. This was the moment of the Israeli strike, and the missiles that are being fired from Gaza now are in response to this, the downing of this building. That was how it was left for a while, and then about 30 minutes later, another missile strike brought the remaining part of the building down. So back to the situation in Sderot, about 2 kilometers away from the Gaza Strip, where several people have been injured by a missile which was fired from Gaza a little earlier. We'll take a short break. We'll be back with more live coverage in just a few moments here on Al Jazeera.
From the Al Jazeera London Broadcast Centre, 2 people in thoughtful conversation.
The struggles that we see in the global south have come not because of our help, but because of the harm of the global north.
With no host and no limitation.
That's the story of climate change. It's not that we're all in it together.
لم يتم تسمية مبعوث خاص، مع أنه هناك مبعوث خاص إلى اليمن ومبعوث خاص لملف إيران وقضايا أخرى. لذا إدارة بايدن لم تولي هذا الملف أهمية كبيرة، والآن ربما يعني تجد نفسها متأخرة في ممارسة هذه الضغوط. طبعا يأتي هذا أيضا مع ما سمعناه من وزير الدفاع، بيان صدر عن البنتاغون بأن وزير الدفاع الأمريكي اتصل بنظيره الإسرائيلي وشدد على دعم واشنطن لإسرائيل في حقها في الدفاع عن نفسها. لذا يعني ما يجري في أروقة مجلس الأمن حاليا جمال بالتوازي مع هذه التصريحات التي يعتبرها يعني تعتبر من قبل الكثيرين ميالة أكثر للموقف الإسرائيلي مع فشل المحادثات والجهود التي تتم خلف الكواليس من خلال هذه الاتصالات. إلى أين يعني ستذهب كل هذه الأمور لا نعلم حتى الآن، ولكن حتى الرئيس الأمريكي جو بايدن يعني سواء الرسالة التي وجهها إلى الرئيس الفلسطيني محمود عباس لم نسمع حتى الآن بأنه كان هناك أي اتصال ربما لرئيس الوزراء يعني لنتنياهو أو يعني أي تحرك من بايدن أو كلام من بايدن، تصريحات علنية حول ما يحدث حاليا. هناك طبعا قضايا أخرى داخلية ربما تنشغل بها الإدارة الأمريكية، ولكن الوضع في غزة وفي القدس ربما خرج عن الإطار الذي كانوا يتوقعونه خلال الأيام الماضية، خصوصا حين نعود إلى قبل يومين المشاورات التي تمت في مجلس الأمن قبل التطورات في غزة. حينها أيضا عرقلت الولايات المتحدة إصدار بيان يعرب عن القلق بشأن أوضاع العائلات الفلسطينية المهددة بالطرد من منازلها في حي الشيخ جراح. وكان أيضا البيان يعني المسودة التي كان قد تم توزيعها في ذلك الوقت من قبل النرويج وتونس والصين رئيسة المجلس حاليا، يعني حين تقرأ بعض الفقرات فيها مشابهة لبعض البيانات التي أصدرتها الإدارة الأمريكية في بداية الأسبوع أو نهاية الأسبوع الماضي حين كانت التطورات في القدس تحدث، طبعا مع إضافة يعني حينها فقرات إضافية، وهذا حسب مسودة، وحينها لم يصدر مجلس الأمن الدولي ذلك البيان الذي كان قد تم توزيع مسودة منه في تلك
أرجو أن تبقي معنا. نريد أتحول إلى عسقلان ومراسل الجزيرة الياس كرام. الياس، هل من نتائج للقصف الذي تعرضت له البلدات المحيطة بغزة هذا اليوم؟
نعم بالفعل، الإسعاف الإسرائيلي يتحدث على الأقل عن 3 إصابات خطيرة في مدينة إزديرون.
Another high-rise tower block, the 14-story Al-Sharouk Tower, was destroyed around 90 minutes ago. 30 minutes earlier, Israeli jets partially bombed the building as a warning for people to evacuate. Hamas has launched another barrage of rockets from Gaza. It says it's in response to the killing of senior Hamas commanders, including its military chief. It follows the launch of more than 1,000 rockets last night. 5 civilians and a soldier were reported killed in Israel. Let's go live now to Gaza. Yumna Al-Sayed is a journalist based there. What's happening there now, Yumna?
Well, as you can see or hear around me, the smoke is filling the skies of the Gaza Strip. The air raids, unfortunately, are still going on until this moment. 3 people were killed in Nusayrat, in the central of the Gaza Strip, just a while ago. Another targeting was in Tel al-Hawa, in the northern, a little bit closer to Gaza City, and a number of people have been injured. Ambulances have run to the place. We still don't know what the numbers of the casualties are because this targeting in Tel al-Hawa just took place. But in Nusayrat, 3 were killed and a number of people were wounded. As you mentioned yourself, 130 rockets were launched from the Gaza Strip by Hamas brigades in retaliation, as they said, for the air raids that brought down a Sharouk tower and for the assassination of the leaders of the Gaza brigade earlier today.
Yumna, why would Al-Sharouk Tower have been targeted by Israel? While you've been talking, we've been looking at pictures of the moment that it was brought down.
Well, this actually brings or talks for itself about the truth that that Israel is trying to hide or mislead to. That it is only targeting towers that have terrorists or people who are launching rockets towards Israeli towns. But this is a tower that mainly only hosts media offices, organizations, and shops, and probably a couple of doctor offices and some restaurants. It does not. It's in a very populated residential area. There's nothing around it. There's no space around it. There's no space around Shuruq Tower. If the cameras could show you in the place itself, it is surrounded by shops, by a bank, by lots of restaurants. The opposite is the same thing, which means that it is a place that is totally away from any kind of terrorism. And this just shows the truth about the Israeli side of the story, saying that it only targets those places that they know that have tourists or people who are launching rockets towards them. I think that the only reason that this tower has been targeted and Al Jawhara Tower has also been targeted, which is not a coincidence, that the major two towers that have or hold the media offices, or 3/4 of the media offices in the Gaza Strip, get to be targeted. They're evacuated and they're targeted. So this can't be any kind of coincidence. This is deliberate and direct targeting to the media voice in the Gaza Strip.
All right, Yumna, many thanks indeed. That's journalist Yumna Al-Sayed, who's based there in Gaza. Al Jazeera's Harry Fawcett is in southern Israel. Harry, we've been looking at live pictures from Sderot, where a missile has hit an apartment building. What are you hearing about that?
That's right, yes, that was part of that very large barrage that was fired from Gaza shortly after the destruction of that building. As we were just hearing Hamas saying that it was in response to that destruction, and 3 people, one of them seriously injured in Sderot. And as well as that, of course, the areas more northerly in Gush Dan and around Tel Aviv also targeted. As far as the Israeli government is concerned, there is a meeting going on of the Security Cabinet this evening to discuss next steps about possible expansion of this already very much expanded military operation. The Prime Minister has also been talking about the killing of those 6 senior Hamas commanders inside Gaza, promising that more such action would follow.
I said yesterday that these sons of darkness, the terrorists of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they bear responsibility. A short while ago, we eliminated senior commanders in the Hamas General Command, including the commander of Gaza Brigade and other commanders. This is just the beginning. We will strike them with hits they did not dream of.
Harry, how's the Israeli government likely to deal with the international pressure that's being applied upon it at the moment to stop its action?
Well, there is a good deal of words coming from international governments and non-governmental organizations calling on both sides to restrict their actions and to step back from the edge of potential full-blown war. We've seen the attempts by the Egyptians to mediate, which have so far come to naught. In previous rounds of escalation, more minor than this one, that has usually been the route to try to get both sides talking together through an intermediary, that intermediary being the Egyptian interlocutors. So far, no success in those efforts. What we're also hearing from the Israeli media is that a senior U.S. envoy, Hadi Amr, who will be making his first trip as Middle East envoy in the coming hours to try to bring the Biden administration's perspective into play and to try to persuade the sides, particularly Israel, you would imagine, given that that's where he will be heading first, that try to persuade them to try to draw back somewhat. Now, there were diplomats quoted with that story in the Israeli media earlier in the day, those same diplomats saying that the Israeli government would certainly make its own decisions and would not be pushed into changing its policy, even from the United States, the main ally of Israel. And all the indications coming from the top of the Israeli government are that they intend to expand, accelerate, and keep going with this military attack.
Al Jazeera's Harry Fawcett, live there in southern Israel. For the moment, Harry, many thanks indeed. We're hearing that the US Defense Secretary has spoken to his Israeli counterpart. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is asking for both sides to cease the violence. Let's go live now to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. What's the administration saying about this right now?
It's clear that the White House has been working very hard in the last 24 hours, doing an enormous amount of outreach to both Israeli as Palestinian officials at a number of different levels within those organizational structures in order to convey one singular message, and that is de-escalation. And what we know now from the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is that in order to try and achieve that, because it appears that those public as well as private statements to nudge Israel to de-escalate specifically have not been effective. As a result, the Secretary of State announcing that the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israel and Palestine Affairs is headed or will be heading very shortly to the region to meet with Israeli as well as Palestinian leaders in order to try and achieve a containment of the violence, to get it to stop. Now, we also know, and Al Jazeera has spoken to a senior administration official about whether or not within these phone calls and communications, if there was a message sent to Israel that a ground operation would be a bad idea. The official would not confirm or deny whether that question was specifically asked, only saying that Israel knows where the United States stands, that it does not want to see this get any more escalated in terms of the fighting. In fact, just the opposite. They're deeply concerned about civilians as well as children that are being caught in the crossfire. And so as a result, there is a number of different outreach that is taking place right now. We know from the White House press secretary there have been more than 25 phone calls in the last 24 hours in order to try and bring the temperature down. We also know that the United States is working with Qatari officials as well as Egyptian officials that they say have channels to Hamas in order to try and bring the temperature down. And as a result of this, we also know that the National Security Advisor on his part here in the United States has also been speaking to his counterpart. Now, in terms of the public statements, what we are hearing from the administration, specifically Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, is that the United States has communicated to Israel that there is ironclad support from the United States for its right to defend itself. It also is saying that it condemns the attacks, rocket attacks by Hamas into Israel from Gaza. But there are also statements of support for the Palestinians coming from the Biden administration, namely from the Secretary of State, saying that we believe that the Palestinians and Israelis equally deserve to live in safety and security. They, again, are very concerned about the fact that and this was communicated by the White House press secretary about 24 hours ago, that the evictions that took place in occupied East Jerusalem have not been helpful. They have articulated this. The White House press secretary saying there was a candid conversation about this with Israel. And again, because these conversations have not resulted in the de-escalation of violence that this administration is seeking, it is now dispatching a high-level official to try and work with both sides. As well, we should point out that there has been an announcement by the White House press secretary in just the last hour that there will be an imminent announcement in the coming days, weeks, with respect to a new Israeli ambassador being announced by the Biden administration.
Our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett there live in Washington. Kimberly, many thanks. Calls grew on Wednesday for a de-escalation from nations all over the world. China expressed deep concern and urged all parties to exercise restraint in order to avoid further casualties. Russia is calling on Israel to stop all settlement activity in Palestinian territories. Russia's President Vladimir Putin and Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan spoke on Wednesday, with Erdogan demanding that Israel be given, quote, a strong and deterrent lesson for its treatment of Palestinians. The EU says the priority should be de-escalation and the prevention of civilian deaths. Germany, though, says that Israel has a right to self-defense against rockets being fired out of Gaza, and the UN Security Council is meeting for an emergency session on the escalation later. And just to, as you can see, rather, an Israeli airstrike has targeted another high-rise tower building. This 14-story Al-Sharuq tower was destroyed around, over 90 minutes ago now. Before that, Israeli jets had partially bombed the building as a warning for people to evacuate. In response, Israel has fired rockets back into Israel. We know that one of those rockets had hit an apartment building in Sderot, which is about 2 kilometers from the border with Gaza. And we're hearing that at least one person has been killed by missile fire in Sderot. Let's bring in Sami Abu Salam, who's a Palestinian journalist. He joins us now live via Skype from Gaza. What are your thoughts on what is going on at the moment and where this is all going and how it brings to an end? How many more people have to die before it ends? We're not having much luck with our internet connection to Gaza at the moment. I'm afraid we don't seem to be able to speak to our guest. We'll come back to him as soon as we can. The UN Security Council has been meeting to discuss the situation in Gaza and Israel. Let's go live there now and talk to our correspondent, Kristen Salumi. This is the second meeting that the Security Council has had about this week, isn't it, Kristen?
That's right. The second meeting has ended now, and absolutely no word from the Security Council on the situation in the Middle East. There were 2 closed-door meetings in as many days, 2 briefings from the UN's Special Coordinator for Middle East Peace, Tor Venesland. He has warned of a spiral of violence leading to a possible full-scale war in the Middle East. He's talked about this taking a devastating toll on ordinary people and has publicly come out and called on both sides to take steps to de-escalate the violence. But when it comes to the council speaking out, not a word. And we are told that it is the United States that is blocking a unified statement from the council from coming forth, despite the fact that all other members of the council did want to make a statement. We reached out to the United States, and they tell us that the U.S. is engaging constructively to ensure that any action taken by the Security Council is helpful in de-escalating tensions. That we know is a disappointment to many of the diplomats here and the Secretary General. The spokesperson for whom told us that a strong international response, a unified international response, is always helpful in a crisis situation. But given that there is this gridlock in the council now, we are beginning to hear from other countries individually. At any moment, we expect European countries to come out and make a unified statement, perhaps along the lines of what was proposed in the council by Norway, China, and Tunisia. Earlier this week, we know Norway proposed an even more watered-down version of that today in an attempt to get some form of unity, but that just doesn't seem possible.
Al Jazeera's Kristen Salumi, live at the UN in New York. Kristen, thanks. Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shataya called on the United Nations to intervene.
The Cabinet of Ministers is doing all what it can to protect our people and to end the Israeli aggression. Therefore, we will immediately provide all the assistance needed by our people in Gaza. Meanwhile, we call on the UN to ensure its resolutions are implemented to provide international protection to our people and to end the illegal measures in Jerusalem, and also to completely end the unjust siege laid to Gaza Strip. I also call on the Arab and Muslim states to implement what they have recently agreed upon.
Sami Abu Salam is a Palestinian journalist and joins us now live via Skype from Gaza. Good to talk to you at last, Sami. What do you make of the international reaction so far to all of this? Bearing in mind, I don't know whether you heard our correspondent there saying that the UN Security Council unable to release a statement on this because it's been blocked again for the second time by the US.
Yes, this is the political status quo. The international community, the UN, the United Nations, or the Quartet, or the United States, specifically the United States, I do not claim that they cannot pressurize Israel, but they don't care and they do not want to pressurize Israel. I believe that the United States alone, just the United States, can put enough pressure on Israel to stop aggressions and to stop seizing land and to stop air raids on Gaza, but they are biased with Israel. For example, in the beginning of the peace process in the beginning of 1991, the United States stopped financially settlements. So all building the settlement has been stopped at that time, which means it was a practical step and real step. And the United States at that time put this pressure to go on after the first Gulf War to absorb the Arab sensitivity or the Arab sympathy, which means, that the United States can put pressure on Israel or or any other great power. Regarding the UN, it is obvious, or the United Nations in general, it is really they cannot.
Okay.
And you see what happened during Trump administration, who neglected the ICC and neglected the UN and the United Nations. United Nations.
So, Sami,
United Nations organ. But on the ground.
How, Sami, does this end then? I mean, who has to mediate here? How quickly can it be brought to some sort of conclusion? How many more people have to die before that happens? Before somebody makes both sides see sense? We're hearing now that a 6-year-old child was killed in that latest rocket attack, which hit Sderot.
This is it is very good question. You remember in the aggression of 2014, in the first couple of days, there were maybe 50 Palestinians have been killed, and the procedures to stop the clashes faced lots of obstacles. But after 51 days, the Palestinians, more than 2,000 Palestinians have been killed. Then they reached to settlement, which means that we are afraid here as a Gazans. We are afraid that the truce will be imposed after thousands of Palestinians are going to die. This is the dilemma. We are afraid. That's why we are so enthusiastic. We are full of hope that this aggression should stop right now and immediately. Immediately how? By real pressure by the United States. The United States is the touchstone to stop this aggression. And even the diplomatic statements we hear, or the Palestinian people are hearing, they don't care about it. What the Prime Minister said, or what the President Biden said, or the spokesperson of the American administration, what he said, people do not care about that. People do care not to see rockets in the sky. they do care not to see their buildings are being hit and falling down and to be homeless. They need practical and real efforts to stop this aggression. So far, around four residential towers have been flattened, and the United States or any other efforts, they are stopped. There is another point that the United States or any other so-called great countries, they call, for example, they said they are going to put pressure on Hamas to stop, to accept the truth, which means that Hamas is attacking, and they neglect Israel, or they are making balance. Yeah. The real stopper and the real part which can put an end for this bloodshed is Israel. Israel is the main obstacle, which means that the key of the solution is with President Biden to stop the bloodshed.
Sami, good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed. Sami Abu Salam there, a Palestinian journalist in Gaza. The Palestinian Authority is set to meet in the next hour to discuss the escalating violence. Al Jazeera's Nida Ibrahim reports now from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank.
One element that the Palestinian leadership is focusing on is the diplomatic effort, is trying to reach out to the international community. We've heard from several Palestinian officials who say that the international community's response hasn't been as strong as they hoped for. We've also heard from the Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayeh, who says that this is a natural explosion because the reason for it is the Israeli crimes, as far as Mohammed Shtayeh put it. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has been holding calls with different leaders of the world, including Jordan's King Abdullah, as well as the Iraqi president and the EU's High Representative Joseph Borrell.
Earlier, one of our Al Jazeera Arabic colleagues spoke to the director of Al Shifa Hospital in Gaza. He says the attacks have put pressure on a medical system which was already stretched to breaking point.
The situation is more than dire, simply because Gaza Strip, as you know, has been under tight siege for the past 14 years. The siege has exhausted the entire healthcare sector in the Strip. In addition, we were hit by the coronavirus pandemic, which we have been fighting for more than a year now. Israel's recent unjust and belligerent aggression has come to add insult to injury. And as you see for your own eyes, innocent women and children are victims. Most of their bodies are torn apart. Needless to say that our operation rooms have been suffering lack of supplies over the past 15 years. Consumables and medicines are in sharp shortage in the entire Gaza Strip. This hospital has been running on the same devices and appliances for the past 20 years.
There's something of a parallel crisis unfolding in Israel's mixed Palestinian-Israeli towns and neighbourhoods. In Lid, the mayor described it as being like a civil war. In neighbouring Ramla, ultra-nationalist Israeli demonstrators were filmed attacking cars being driven by Palestinian Israelis, causing them to crash. While in the northern port town of Accra, witnesses said that protesters set a Jewish-owned restaurant and hotel on fire. Merav Zonzain is a senior analyst on Israel and Palestine at Crisis Group. She says that Palestinian Israelis face systematic discrimination.
Unfortunately, in some ways, the chicken has come home to roost. Israeli policies in mixed Palestinian-Israeli towns has never really been one of coexistence. There's been discrimination. The same discrimination that you see in East Jerusalem happens inside Israel as well, as far as housing policies, discrimination in rights, in all various aspects of life, crime and negligence of the government, which Palestinian Arab-Israeli parties have been calling out for years, asking for higher budgets, asking for the police to rein in on these violence. None of that has been happening. The government has neglected that. And when we don't see the images of violence, what we have is a policy that is incendiary, that sends budgets for Jewish people to build more and more housing and doesn't allow the same thing for Palestinian citizens. And what we're seeing is the result, together with the convergence of what's been happening in East Jerusalem and in Gaza. Palestinian citizens have been increasingly voting for their representatives to have increased power in politics and to try to change their situation through the political system. Throughout the coronavirus, Israelis have pointed to the fact that Palestinian citizens, the pharmacists, the doctors, they have been actively involved in society. They want to be a more part of the system and integrated, and to have more equal rights and achievements. But as far as coexistence, this has always been an illusion. Israel has a policy of discrimination on all fronts.
Hanan Ashrawi is a Palestinian leader, activist and former member of the Palestine Liberation Organization's Executive Committee. She says that Israel has been acting with impunity.
You have here an unbridled use of violence by the strongest army in the region, targeting innocent civilians, targeting residential buildings in an area that has been totally closed in, besieged, without any means of defense, with no air force, with no shelters, with no sirens, and at the same time the Israelis claim self-defense. It's not just humanitarian, it's an existential issue. It's political, it's legal, yes, it is human, and it is not certainly military, because Israel's use of the military is punitive, is immoral, and in many ways it is an expression of an unbridled occupation that has existed with impunity for all these years, that has never been held accountable since it was created 73 years ago, since the other occupation 54 years ago. Israel has acted with full impunity and has targeted the Palestinians as a captive population under its control and outside the law. But this is not new. This escalation is new. It has been emboldened, of course, by the Trump administration's collusion. It has been emboldened by the Biden administration's lack of action and the reticence of the Europeans, and it's been ongoing. So now the question was, do you allow Israel to target Jerusalem, to kick out Palestinians, to target the holiest Islamic site here in the middle of Ramadan, and to get away with it? Now, they were warned, Hamas warned them, everybody else warned them. You are crossing not just red lines, you are provoking. You are provoking the Palestinians beyond endurance. You are provoking Arabs and Muslims and Christians everywhere. Just stop it. Not only didn't they stop, they escalated.
As you can see, an Israeli airstrike has targeted another high-rise tower building in Gaza. The 14-story Al-Sharouk Tower was destroyed, 2 hours ago now. Half an hour before that, Israeli jets had partially bombed the building as a warning for people to evacuate. In response, Hamas has fired rockets back into Israel, one of those landing in Sderot, where we hear that a 6-year-old boy has been killed. The news continues here on Al Jazeera after Inside Story next.
Two letters and many warnings. A group of former and current military soldiers accuse the French president of giving in too much to Islamism. They claim the country's survival is at risk. A political maneuver, or does it reflect a real malaise of French society? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohamed Jamjoum. Civil war is brewing in France. That's the warning from a number of French soldiers to President Emmanuel Macron for the second time. They accuse the president of granting what they called concessions to Islamism. The open letter was posted on a far-right website, Valeurs Actuelles, and echoed a similar text published last month by a group of retired generals. But this time it was open to the public, and the website says it received tens of thousands of signatories. At least 18 soldiers involved in April's letter face sanctions before a military court. Both letters were condemned by the French government, but welcomed by far-right leader Marine Le Pen, who is seen as Macron's main rival in next year's presidential election. In parts of the letter addressed to President Macron and his cabinet, soldiers said, "We are not talking about extending your mandate or conquering others. We're talking about the survival of our country, the survival of your country. They describe themselves as part of a younger generation of soldiers who, quote, have offered up their lives to destroy the Islamic.
war crimes. And this is exactly what the Palestinian Authority, President Abbas, is insisting on. And he and starting an investigation of war crimes. And Israel has said previously that it will not allow the ICC investigators to enter Israel and to conduct their investigation. And they definitely deny and reject any of these allegations of them trying, or at least going after civilians. They say that these are legitimate targets, and that's why they are targeting them.
Okay, Mohammed Al-Qasim in occupied East Jerusalem. Thank you. Thank you as well to Mohammed Alami in Ramallah and, of course, Nizar Sadawi in Gaza. Well, let's bring in Khalid Beydoun. He's a law professor at Wayne State University School of Law, and he's joining us from Detroit. Mr. Beydoun, thank you for being with us here on TRT World. Let's begin at where I think we can start from with this. Has the international community let the Palestinians down?
Definitely on many levels. International organizations like the UN, the Arab League, governments, nation states, politicians, the silence is deafening over the last couple of days with regard to what's happening first in Sheikh Jarrah and now obviously in Gaza.
But it's not just the past couple of days, is it? It's been decades now where the Palestinian cause has not been given the support that it needs in the international arena.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a prolonged issue. Calling it a clash or a crisis, I think, is a misnomer. The power difference is clear, and you have, a Palestinian people that are being incessantly pummeled, persecuted, and we're now seeing, very vividly the sort of fruit of that, global apathy about this issue.
I mean, the terms are set, and you and I will have seen this over the past few decades and seen the situation for the Palestinian people. We all know what's happening in that region, so I must ask, why has nothing changed? Why has there been no difference? Why did we see under the Trump administration this sort of faux two-state solution, which was never anything of the name?
Yeah, I can go on for hours as to why things haven't changed, but I think that a primary reason why things haven't changed is, the sort of stereotyping and caricaturing of the Palestinian people as, inferior, as subhuman, as terrorists, as, a population that is deserving of this violence that is being inflicted upon them. I think that, looking at this from a racial dimension is very important. Second, you've had in the United States, where I live, bipartisan support for the state of Israel and almost unfettered bipartisan support. So even though Trump was more zealous in his, or explicit in his support of, a more hawkish Israeli posture, the Democratic Party now under Biden and Kamala Harris has been silent. The funds are continuing to the state of Israel. Weapons are continuing to the state of Israel. So there's, consensus support for the state of Israel across the political spectrum here in the United States, which makes it very difficult to change things and to better the conditions in the lives of Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza.
Let's leave the support for Israel to side for 1 minute and dig into that racial element that you mentioned there, because that is a fascinating area to explore. Are you suggesting there is still, in 2021, a massive othering of the Palestinian people?
Oh, definitely. I think that if you look at headlines from prominent newspapers like the New York Times or the Washington Post, if you navigate past or through social media timelines on Twitter, on Instagram, and so on and so forth, you can see the very stark racialization of Palestinians as being a lesser people. And especially when you sort of construct this broader binary, the state of Israel is viewed as a white nation. It is a white majority nation where, the sort of tinge of, white supremacy is domineering the sort of narrative going on in Palestine. So you have an Israeli population that is perceived and very much demographically a white population, pummeling a brown and other population, which are the Palestinians, I think, which in the broader sort of, imagination are viewed to be lesser. And when you're viewed as lesser and other, that invites and facilitates violence. And not only facilitates violence, but it sort of curries an acceptance, a broader sort of universal acceptability that a brown and non-white people are deserving of this violence.
Yeah, and that binary is buttressed by that unwavering support by the American state for the Israeli state, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. I think that, look, I mean, the United States, we all know, is a colonial settler state. You can draw analogies with the Palestinian people, with indigenous or Native Americans here stateside. So there's let's call it a epistemological affinity that the United States has for a settler colonial state like the state of Israel, doing exactly the same thing that the United States did many, many years ago. And I think that, look, this might sound rhetorical to the viewers. This might sound like it's sort of academic talk to the viewers, but it's deeper than that because most Americans, most lay Americans who support the imperial objectives of the United States see what's happening in Israel and they support it.
Absolutely. Okay, Khalid Beydoun, we could talk all evening, but we have to leave it there. And it's definitely not a rhetorical academic debate. It's massively important. Thank you very much for your analysis. All right, let's take a look now at how we were able to get to this point in the occupied territories.
On Wednesday morning, people in Gaza woke up to hundreds of Israeli airstrikes. Entire apartment blocks have been toppled. Hundreds of people are displaced, and thousands more have fled their homes. The Israeli military has beefed up its presence near Gaza, sending in additional troops and tanks. Israel says its jets have targeted and killed several Hamas intelligence leaders. Violence has also flared in the occupied West Bank, where a 26-year-old Palestinian was killed by Israeli gunfire at a refugee camp near Hebron. In Ramallah, Israeli security forces have used stun grenades to disperse Palestinian protesters. The unrest follows weeks of tension over the planned forceful eviction of Palestinians from their homes in occupied East Jerusalem. On Monday, while hundreds of people were praying, Israeli soldiers and police stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the most contested religious sites in the world.
They have no respect for prayer or religion, for older young people. Any person is vulnerable and can be hit at any moment. But we are stubborn people who don't give up. We are stronger than the rockets, bullets, tanks and aeroplanes, and God sees.
On Tuesday night, about 70 kilometers up the coast, in the Israeli cities of Tel Aviv and Beersheva, residents ran to shelters as rockets fired by Hamas and other groups lit up the sky. Most of the rockets were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome defense system. A state of emergency has been declared in the central city of Lod after protests by Palestinians escalated to full-scale riots. Lod and other towns with mixed populations have been gripped by angry demonstrations.
We must act against all of those who try to attack Israeli citizens or the state of Israel.
The violence in Lod broke out after the funeral of a Palestinian who had been killed by an Israeli settler a day earlier. The international community has appealed for an end to the unrest.
These kinds of attacks must stop. We have to protect the rights of the Palestinians within the framework of international law, of course.
The United Nations is urging Israel to avoid forced expulsions and employ maximum restraint. But UN Middle East peace envoy Tor Wenslin has warned that the situation is escalating towards a full-scale war. Natasha Hussain, TRT World.
Munir Nusibeh is a professor of international law at Al-Quds University. He says that the international community has failed to hold Israel accountable for its crimes.
Israel, unfortunately, has been used to impunity for all the decades of its life since 1948, since it was established on the land of Palestine. It has been protected by the world's superpowers, most importantly the United States, actually, but also before that, France and Britain. The United Nations Security Council have been immunizing Israel from any sanctions, regardless of how what types of crimes it conducted. And this has been the case until now. The development of the International Criminal Court is quite recent, and I think that Israel is still not used to the fact that there is an international court that has jurisdiction over the occupied Palestinian territory and has jurisdiction over its soldiers and leaders because they are committing crimes in the occupied Palestinian territory. So they are still going on with their old narrative. They always have two stories to tell. Either that the court is anti-Semitic, which is obviously a crazy allegation. Also, they always use another argument that somehow all the states single them out without any justification. And that despite the fact that there are human rights violations happening everywhere around the world, that as if everybody is focusing only on Israel, and that's also not true.
Well, William Shabas is a professor of international law at Middlesex University in the UK, and he was the former chairman of the 2014 UN Commission of Inquiry into the Gaza war. He says the international community must act.
Most of the countries, the European Union, many of the other Western powers have insisted that the Fourth Geneva Convention applies to the occupied territories. A few of them, I should say a few, more than a few of them, have quietly tried to undermine the efforts of the International Criminal Court to address the war crimes, particularly the war crime of transferring settlers into an occupied territory. You know, it's again, the analogy with South Africa is hard to resist. In South Africa, the Western countries, by and large, gave their support to the apartheid regime for many years, and then gradually that began to weaken, and we have to hope that that will weaken too. Of course, Israel has a powerful military, an unbeatable military in many respects in that area. And but the isolation is what it needs. And unfortunately, last year, just about a year ago, the Israeli regime was greatly encouraged by Trump's shift in the American position. We're all waiting anxiously to see whether Biden is going to roll back from that, because that position has changed in several respects. And it was a terrible encouragement to the Israeli regime, a terrible blow to the Palestinians. Palestinians have also been deserted by some of the Gulf states who were traditional supporters, and this too has weakened them. So this is a desirable change, and hopefully, I mean, what has to happen is that Israel has to reach that understanding that the apartheid regime in South Africa did in 1990, is that they can't go on like this, and this has to change, and it has to be a dramatic political change.
Well, the United States has been conspicuously reticent to try and criticize the Israeli army for its airstrikes on Gaza. Our correspondent Yunus Paksoy was able to put a question to the State Department spokesperson on just that yesterday. Here's what he had to say.
By saying that we're condemning the rocket attacks into Israel. And today was no different. You again condemned the attacks against Israel by the Palestinian side. But yesterday, you fell short of condemning the pictures of Palestinian children killed as a result of Israeli airstrikes. Have you seen those pictures, first of all, and does the State Department have anything to say against that?
I have seen those pictures. It's hard not to look at those pictures and feel, sense the suffering. It is precisely why today we have called for restraint and de-escalation in an effort to preserve civilian life. And we recognize that Israelis have been killed, Palestinians have been killed.
Well, let's go to Washington now and bring in our reporter Yunus Paksoy, who's joining us live. Yunus, I understand there have been some developments from the US's side in the past few minutes. Just bring us up to speed on that, please.
We've just heard from Secretary of State Antony Blinken as he gave a press conference today at the State Department that he's sending the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State to the region to immediately speak with Israelis and Palestinians to urge them for calm and also de-escalation. And also the Secretary of State said that the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State is going to urge both sides on his behalf and also on behalf of the President Biden. And the United States is trying to actually make it look like they are playing a mediating role. But again, today's press conference started off by, again, condemning the attacks against innocent Israeli civilians. But we haven't heard an immediate reaction from the Secretary of State against attacks on Palestinian civilians. And let's remember, over the past several days, we've seen several dozen Palestinian civilians killed in Israeli airstrikes, and so many children casualties as well. We've all seen those images that the Secretary of State described as harrowing. But still, the United States still shies away from condemning any Israeli atrocity in the region.
Yeah, and they've set themselves up, as you say, Yunus, as a sort of a mediator role in this. So it remains to be seen what happens when that envoy does arrive in the region. But I do wonder, in the past hour or so, we have seen an airstrike on a building that housed TV stations. Of course, the US will have to answer to that as civilian target being struck by the Israeli Air Force, and how they'll be able to pass that is one for anyone's guess.
Well, it doesn't really look like the US feels the responsibility to respond to anything, or they are not going to answer to any of the atrocities committed by the Israeli army, because the mentality in Washington, D.C. right now is that, let me explain that to our viewers really clearly. They're saying that the attacks that are coming from the Palestinian side are committed by terrorist organizations and Hamas. So that's why they're saying that Israel has a right to defend itself. And even though that right to defend itself, quote unquote, is killing civilians, including children, they're not condemning any of those attacks, and they're saying that there is a legitimate right to self-defense on the side of the Israelis. But when they are asked whether the Palestinians have a right to self-defense, they're not answering that question, because they're saying that states have a right to defend themselves, and they are not clearly recognizing Palestine as a state. So that is the dilemma here. The United States is trying to be the mediator. They're trying to find the common ground, but they're not even in the common. They are on the side of the Israelis, and they are making that very, very well known by their statements.
Okay, Yunus in Washington, appreciate that reporting. Thank you for that. And thanks to all of our reporters and guests for our continued special coverage of the situation in the occupied territories. We'll leave you now this hour with these pictures from Palestine. Do stay with us here on TRT World.
The world is facing an existential emergency. A threat to every living being on the only known habitable planet in the universe. The climate crisis is growing and must be confronted. We examine the challenges, the science, and the solutions needed to keep us alive as global temperatures rise. Just 2 degrees on TRT World.
Check out the new trtworld.com for all the latest news from around the world. Perfect for your laptop, phone or tablet. trtworld.com.
what sparked the whole issue is Sheikh Jarrah. 13 families were under eviction. Now Israeli police is trying to disperse the crowd again.
You fall short of condemning the pictures of Palestinian children killed as a result of Israeli airstrikes. Have you seen those pictures, first of all, and does the State Department have anything to say against that?
I have seen those pictures. It's hard not to look at those pictures and feel, sense the suffering.
That is exactly why so many people, not only in the region, but also here, are really tired of these statements.
Today, we see hundreds of people gathered here to show their solidarity with the Palestinian people.
Palestinians under attack on TRT World.
You're watching TRT World live from London, and this is the News Hour with me, Martin Stamford. Fears are growing that the deadly exchange of fire between Israel and Palestinian groups in Gaza could turn into a full-scale war. Israel has carried out hundreds of airstrikes on Gaza, killing at least 56 Palestinians. 14 children are amongst the dead. More than 1,000 rockets have now been fired by Palestinian groups, mostly at Tel Aviv. 6 Israelis are dead. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, says he's gravely concerned by the ongoing violence. Natasha Hussein reports.
On Wednesday morning, people in Gaza woke up to hundreds of Israeli airstrikes. Entire apartment blocks have been toppled. Hundreds of people are displaced, and thousands more have fled their homes. The Israeli military has beefed up its presence near Gaza, sending in additional troops and tanks. Israel says its jets have targeted and killed several Hamas intelligence leaders. Violence has also flared in the occupied West Bank, where a 26-year-old Palestinian was killed by Israeli gunfire at a refugee camp near Hebron. In Ramallah, Israeli security forces have used stun grenades to disperse Palestinian protesters. The unrest follows weeks of tension over the planned forceful eviction of Palestinians from their homes in occupied East Jerusalem. On Monday, while hundreds of people were praying, Israeli soldiers and police stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the most contested religious sites in the world.
They have no respect for prayer or religion for older young people. Any person is vulnerable and can be hit at any moment. But we are stubborn people who don't give up. We are stronger than the rockets, bullets, tanks and aeroplanes, and God sees.
On Tuesday night, about 70 kilometers up the coast, in the Israeli cities of Tel Aviv and Beersheva, residents ran to shelters as rockets fired by Hamas and other groups lit up the sky. Most of the rockets were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome defense system. A state of emergency has been declared in the central city of Lod after protests by Palestinians escalated to full-scale riots. Lod and other towns with mixed populations have been gripped by angry demonstrations.
We must act against all of those who try to attack Israeli citizens or the State of Israel.
The violence in Lod broke out after the funeral of a Palestinian who had been killed by an Israeli settler a day earlier. The international community has appealed for an end to the unrest.
These kinds of attacks must stop. We have to protect the rights of the Palestinians within the framework of international law, of course.
The United Nations is urging Israel to avoid forced expulsions and employ maximum restraint. But UN Middle East peace envoy Tor Wenslin has warned that the situation is escalating towards a full-scale war. Natasha Hussein, TRT World.
And we have more rocket fire to report to you right now. Let's speak to Nizar Zadawi in Gaza. And we can see munitions leaving Gaza tonight.
Yes, quite sure you can see rockets are being fired. Resistance factions here are launching barrages of rockets towards Israeli settlements as a response for the Israeli attack and assassination of top senior commander in Hamas, Bassem Issa, earlier today. Also, the resistance factions here are retaliating the continuous targeting of residential buildings of Palestinian civilians here in Gaza. Just a few minutes ago, an airstrike took place on the eastern side of Gaza City. A massacre, people have been saying, was committed by Israeli warplanes in Ash-Shuja'iyya neighborhood, where at least 2 Palestinians had just been killed. Another one in Beit Hanun for a family who had not been warned to evacuate their house before the house was completely destroyed by Israeli warplanes. We know that Islamic Jihad also vowed to retaliate the assassination attack by launching a barrage of rockets specifically at 9 p.m. And right now we can say that this is 9 p.m. here in Gaza. So that's the Islamic Jihad launching rockets towards Tel Aviv, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and other Israeli territories. Hamas had also launched 2 barrages of rockets so far. We're expecting the situation to snowball into full-blown confrontation later tonight, because Israel continues to target civilians, and obviously Hamas, as they issued a statement stressing that they will not fall into any traps. They will not agree to any potential ceasefire agreement as long as Israel does not stop its atrocities and aggression on the civilians in Gaza and also in Jerusalem, because obviously this condition, this term, is not moving off this table. In case a ceasefire agreement was reached, whether by the mediation of Qatar, Egypt, and the United Nations, as we're hearing in the news, these terms, the stopping of Israeli aggression on Palestinian civilians in Sheikh Jarrah, in Jerusalem, in Al-Aqsa Mosque, and most importantly these days in Gaza, unless Israel accepts these terms, then no truce will be accomplished here in Gaza. That's what I can say. Right now, yeah, apparently they're firing rockets from the other side right now, but I can tell you this is non-stop. We've been hearing these rockets. I'm quite sure you can hear the sounds behind in the Qadr. You may have seen some of these rockets. I think the night will be more intense than expected, despite the intensive efforts made by Egypt, Qatar, and the United Nations.
Nizar, you must stay safe, of course you must. So if it gets too dangerous to continue talking to us, you must say so. But we were seeing reports here in the newsroom about Hamas making an offer of some kind of move to a ceasefire or peace talks. It doesn't look like that tonight, does it?
No, it doesn't. Just 5 minutes ago, actually, before this bulletin started, Abdul Latif Al-Qanoua, one of the spokespersons for Hamas, issued a statement saying that they will not commit or agree to any ceasefire agreement unless these terms that we mentioned are accepted and applied by the Israeli side. Also, they issued another statement by Al-Qassam brigades and the armed wing of Hamas, and also Al-Quds brigade, the armed wing of Islamic Jihad, saying that they vow to retaliate the targeting of civilian buildings in Gaza, and they will not stop unless Israel stops its atrocities first. They will not fall into that trap again. That's what they're saying.
OK, thank you very much indeed for now. We'll come back to you, of course, as the situation develops. Let me tell you that dozens of buildings have now been destroyed as Israel intensifies its aerial bombardment of the Gaza region. This is what happened when a 14-storey block housing shops and media offices was targeted. Let's talk to another one of our team of correspondents who are bringing the very latest to you. TRT World's Mustafa Faith Yonaz joins me now from the occupied East Jerusalem. Mustafa, we've been hearing reports of more fighting in the Lod area. Now, that's quite near the airport today, isn't it? And that would tie in, I guess, with some air traffic telling they may well avoid Tel Aviv airport for the time being.
Well, I think the situation is still tense in the city of Lod, as all the other cities right now, but except for this area right now where I'm in occupied is Jerusalem's Damascus Gate, one of the gates of the old city in here right now. What we've seen so far in here, at least for 10 days, there were lots of Israeli police attacks to Palestinian youth. Despite the fact that the situation is pretty calm in here, I still feel the tense that any time Israeli police attack can appear. But the thing is, yesterday that was last Tarawih, and then there is no Tarawih in here. There won't be any mobilization from Palestinian side to come in here. But as I said before, the calm is on a razor edge. When we look at the Lod, there is a curfew right now, nightly curfew taking place, but the situation is still tense. On Tuesday night, one Palestinian man was killed by an Israeli, and then there was a kind of the city was kind of burning after that issue, and then mayor of Lod was asking Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to declare a state of emergency, and Benjamin Netanyahu did it. And then Reuven Rivlin today, Israel's president, said that it was kind of pogroms for Jewish people in here, and the situation is still tense. It's not only Lod, and also in other city, Bat Yam, in Bat Yam, reportedly Israelis attacked and stormed some shops that belong to some Palestinians there, and I think the situation is still tense. We still do not know how Israelis will de-escalate the situation in Gaza Strip, in occupied East Jerusalem, and in other neighborhood of occupied East Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah. This is where 13 people under the threat of forced eviction there, and also in the other cities, in the northern cities. The most important thing, I think, Martin, in here is that those people are the citizens of Israel. Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, mostly doing protests. They are showing solidarity with Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem, and they are saying that we are with Al-Aqsa, they are saying that we are with Gaza Strip, and it's so hard to know how Israel will de-escalate the situation until today.
The difficulty is, I suppose, that East Jerusalem was where this particular moment of tension, the moment of fighting, the moment of argument started. I guess it could return at any time.
Yes, it can turn violent any time, as I said before. As I said, right now, maybe a couple of Palestinian youth in here, they can come at any time, and then Palestinian and Israeli police are waiting there, but I couldn't see water tanks yet. That was really interesting. I think also what we understand from that picture, that Israeli police also not expecting huge clashes in here, most probably. That's why I think they didn't bring their water tanks, and they didn't deploy lots of police. I think it's like a normal day in here. But as I said, it's on the razor edge. I think still Palestinian youth in here, they are sitting on ladders. Yesterday, while Palestinian youth were here and sitting on ladders of the Damascus Gate, Israeli police used stun grenades. If they do again, I think the clashes can erupt.
Mustafa Fatih Yavuz, thank you very much indeed, reporting from East Jerusalem. Now, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, says he is deeply concerned about the violence in Gaza. Earlier today, he announced that a US is going to send a diplomat to the region.
We're deeply concerned about what we're seeing there. Images that came out overnight are harrowing. And the loss of any civilian life is a tragedy. I've asked Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Hadi Amr to go to the region immediately to meet with Israeli and Palestinian leaders. He will bring to bear his decades of experience, and in particular, he will urge on my behalf and on behalf of President Biden a de-escalation of violence. We are very focused on this.
Let's go live to Washington, D.C. Eunice Paxoy is standing by for us there. America's sending one diplomat. Some observers might want America to do more, Eunice.
Exactly, and the question still remains to this day whether America is willing to do more, because doing more in this context is also going to mean to ask Israel to stop its airstrikes against Palestinian civilians, including children that we've seen all those harrowing images over the last several days where they were put into the morgues inside hospitals and civilians crying in front of the dead bodies of Palestinian civilians and children. So how is it going to happen exactly that the Biden administration and also the State Department is going to call on the Israeli army to stop its attacks? But what's happening right now in Washington, D.C. is that they are sending messages to Israel saying that they have a right to self-defense. And today, the Israeli Prime Minister thanked the Secretary of State personally for his staunch support for Israel. So at this point, it really remains a question, a massive question, how America is going to be able to prove itself to be a mediator.
Okay, Yanis, well, we know that the international diplomacy, such as it is, America, I suppose, will want to try and upset the Israelis.
I guess that's always been in the cards, because it was almost certain that when these incidents started in occupied East Jerusalem, which then spread to Gaza, which resulted in the deaths of several dozen Palestinian civilians, so many people knew for sure that the United States was going to stand with Israel, and they were not going to stand up for the rights of the Palestinian people. So again, diplomatically, they're trying to keep the channels open, and they're trying to give the message to the whole world that they are going to do everything they can to be the mediator in the middle, and they're trying to find a middle ground. But again, the question is, why should the Palestinians believe in what Americans say at this point?
Indeed so, Jonas, and we'll have to watch the developments, I suppose, because other players around the world will also be weighing in. We know that the Egyptians, of course, as often has been the case in tension between particularly Hamas and the Israelis, they have played their part. It's interesting, isn't it, that Joe Biden himself doesn't appear so far to have expressed a view about this.
Well, that again is quite mortifying for so many Palestinian civilians that are living in the United States, that the United States president that has always preached against violence all around the world, and that has always preached for calm and peace across the globe. But so far he has really kept quiet. He hasn't said anything at all about the atrocities that are playing out in the region. So again, it really also tests the credibility of the Biden administration about how much peace they want in the world.
Okay, Jonas, thank you very much indeed for that for the moment. Jonas Paksoy reporting there, fly for us from Washington, D.C. Now, let's hear from the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. He is now in Moscow for talks on the crisis with the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. Guterres spoke about his concern and his commitment to a peace process.
The recent incidents demonstrate how important it is to restart effectively the peace process, because it's the only way. I'm a true believer that we need to promote a two-state solution, living in peace and harmony between the two, and with normalized relations with the region, and the full participation of the countries of the region and the international community as a whole in creating the conditions for this peace process to move forward.
Well, Israel has been accused of committing war crimes with its airstrikes on Gaza, which is home to more than 2 million people. Speaking after an emergency cabinet meeting, the Palestinian Prime Minister, Mohammed Shtayyeh, condemned Israel for being an aggressor against his people.
الجرائم The crimes that are committed by Israel against our people all over Palestine, such as the killing, seizing of lands, demolition of houses, forced expulsion of Palestinians from their homes, limiting of their movements, the sieges in Jerusalem and Gaza with barbed wires and the closure of crossings, all of them are the reason behind this public and national explosion against the occupation, injustice and oppression. The whole world is condemning Israel for its crimes, and the ICC has stated that continuous crimes are being committed against Palestinian people every day.
Well, we're joined by Omar Abdallah from Ramallah. Now, he's Assistant Foreign Minister in the Palestinian Authority with a focus on UN affairs. Omar Abdallah, thank you very much for being part of our programme tonight. There seems to be despair on both sides. Neither side seems to want to de-escalate or even consider peace. How is this going to stop?
Actually, we're calling on the international community to interfere, to stop the aggression from the Israeli side, to stop the Israeli crimes against our people, especially in the occupied Palestinian territory, mainly in our holy city of Jerusalem. We think that the international community should interfere. The international community should use its pressure on Israel to stop the aggression, to stop the crimes, to implement the United Nations resolutions in accordance with the issue of Palestine. This is the way how to stop the Israeli aggression. I can tell you that the Palestinian people are full with hope. They are ready to resist, to free their land, and at the same time they are using the international law
Omar,
tools.
Just got to interrupt you for a moment because we're going to hear from Mahmoud Abbas, who is just speaking now. So we'll come back to you in a moment. Here's Mr. Abbas.
Your occupation today and tomorrow. We will not commit the crime of 1948 or the crime of 1967. The Sheikh Jarrah will not stay down and calm down. And the same for other places. Everyone will not stay calm and they will not leave their places. If you want peace, if you want security, if you want safety, safety cannot come from the power of weapons, cannot come from these tools or methods. Come to a point we agree together. We cannot bear any much more. We won't have any more patience, but we will resist more and more and more, and we will be more resilient more and more until we will achieve victory and liberation, and until we achieve the end of occupation for all of our occupied lands, and on the top of them Jerusalem. Thank you very much.
الكرام كنا وإياكم مع كلمة السيد الرئيس محمود عباس في مستهل.
And that was Mahmoud Abbas, the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, speaking live. So let me just return, if I may, to Omar Abdallah, who is joining us from Ramallah tonight, Assistant Foreign Minister in the PA, and of course has a focus on UN affairs. You were just suggesting, Omar, that we need more international reaction to this. The United Nations has been pretty useless at helping out the Palestinian cause, hasn't it? What would you hope, what would you want them to do now?
Actually, they want us to believe that the international community cannot do anything for the Palestinians, but we believe that if the international community has the will to interfere, has the will to end and to dismantle this Israeli illegal occupation in the occupied Palestinian territory or this illegal apartheid regime in Palestine, they can actually act responsibly in Palestine by implementing the resolutions that they already adopted. So many resolutions were adopted by the international community, and I think if there is a will, they can implement these resolutions. At the same time, our people on the ground, they are now demonstrating, they are now resisting all this oppression with the help of all the international organization with the help of the international tools in Palestine and using the international community's tools that they did. We don't believe that the UN can do nothing. We believe that the UN can use their good offices by sending special powers, special missions to protect the Palestinian people. I think that the protection of the Palestinian people is one of the resolutions that the international community should implement immediately, while Israel is attacking the innocent civilians in Palestine and especially in Jerusalem and in Gaza. There is a role for the international community. There is so many tools to use, sanctions against this occupying power, and so many other tools that they can use.
Okay, it's interesting to hear you talk about, I think you were talking about peacekeeping forces. You would like other nations' soldiers to come in and create a buffer between you and the Israelis.
We asked actually via a resolution by the United Nations for a protection for the Palestinian people, and we left to the Secretary General to organize the way how to do it by international peacekeeping missions, by some states that are willing to protect the Palestinian people from this aggressors, from the Israeli occupying power and their settlers. I think there is so many ways to protect the Palestinian people using the international mechanisms that actually were used before in so many countries.
Mahmoud Abbas, in his remarks, which we played just a moment ago, said, you know, we can't, as a Palestinian people, bear any more of this, but he vowed to keep on fighting until the occupation is ended. They're familiar words. We've heard them so many times before. The truth is, isn't it, that Israel has so much greater firepower that is a very difficult promise to keep from Mr. Abbas?
I think no. I think the peaceful resistance, the popular resistance, we think that using the international law mechanisms, we think that the use of the international will of the international community to confront the illegalities that Israel is creating every day in our occupying land can play a big role. We saw a collapse of so many regimes of apartheid in the ancient world, and we think that can be used in Palestine. Our president added in his speech that we will stay resilient, we will resist, and we will stay here until we dismantle this apartheid regime, until we finish and end this illegal occupation. We believe that we believe in freedom, we believe in achieving our rights, and we think that all the tools that I just mentioned can give and bring results.
Live from Ramallah, thank you for joining us, Omar Awadallah. Thank you very much indeed. Now, to the world of business and Oscar Sobakti.
The UK economy shrank by 1.5% in the first 3 months of the year, but there was a burst of growth in March as lockdown measures began to ease. The mild slump reflected in the official figures was better than what analysts had expected, sparking a rally on the FTSE 100. The 2.1% growth figure for March is particularly encouraging as it marks a possible turning point for the UK economy. The reopening of schools and strong retail spending contributed to the rebound, which was the economy's fastest monthly expansion since August. Meanwhile, official UK trade figures show a shift away from EU countries since Brexit. Imports from Europe remained sluggish in the first quarter, outstripped by non-EU imports for the first time on record. Okay, let's get more on this now with Han Tan in Kuala Lumpur. He's a market analyst at FXTM. Good to have you back with us, Han. Now, finally, some promising news for the UK economy, at least for the month of March. We know that the UK has suffered some historic contractions during this pandemic. Do investors believe that the worst is over, that from here on in perhaps we can see growth rather than contractions?
So the short answer to that, Oscar, is yes. Keep in mind, markets are forward-looking by nature. So when you look at the pound, the fact that it's the best performing G10 currency against the dollar so far this month, it has also strengthened against all its G10 peers on a month-to-date basis. I think that tells us that investors are growing more optimistic about the UK economic outlook. We even had the Bank of England, the central bank, just last week revising upwards their economic forecasts for this year. And I think when you look at what's happening on the ground with the easing of those social distancing measures, the higher vaccination rates, I think all that bodes well for the UK economy and by extension the pound as well, at least in keeping it supported.
Can we take a look at US stocks now? Because the Dow Jones Industrial Average had its worst day since February. And once again, we saw a sell-off on tech stocks leading to that decline. Can you tell us what's going on? Why are we seeing this sell-off right now?
Indeed. So I think the main narrative in the markets right now is the uncertainty or the debate surrounding the U.S. inflation outlook. In fact, we just had breaking numbers here just right before I came on. So if you look at the consumer price index for the U.S., it actually came in higher than expected. I wasn't looking so much at the year-on-year figures because there was a low base effect from the second quarter of last year amid the lockdowns. But even when you look at the month-on-month figures, comparing April's consumer prices compared to March, you are seeing them come in higher than expected. Now, the concern in the market is that if this inflationary pressures actually stick around, as opposed to it being temporary or transitory, that's the word that the Fed used, if it sticks around, that could force the Fed to pull back their support for global financial markets sooner sooner than we had anticipated. So that's why we've been seeing a lot of volatility, not just in U.S. stocks, but also in other asset classes as well.
Yes, it really is turning into a rising inflation story, isn't it? Han Tan from FXTM, thank you as always. Now to other top stories from around the world. Toyota says it expects to return to pre-pandemic profitability this year as it weathers a global chip shortage that's crippled other car makers. The Japanese auto giant has also reported a 10.3% rise in full-year net profit to over $20 billion. Meanwhile, SoftBank Group has posted an annual net profit of nearly $46 billion, the highest ever for any Japanese company. A Paris appeals court has ruled that Air France and Airbus must stand trial on involuntary manslaughter charges over a deadly crash in the Atlantic in 2009. It overturns an earlier ruling that dropped charges against the companies. The carriers plan to appeal the decision. Investigators found the pilots of flight AF447 lost control when airspeed sensors froze. And Amazon has won its legal battle against an EU order to pay about $30 million in back taxes to Luxembourg. Europe's second highest court says the retail giant had not enjoyed a selective advantage in its tax deal with Luxembourg.
ليش عني؟ رب اوصل عني. ليش زواج أجل؟ هتبيع عنوان. أنسوا فلوس. עוד מטר אחורה בבקשה, כי אתה מביא את כולם מכאן. בסוכתה! وعلت خليهم ينكون شو هالقرف يا زلمه اما طلعتوا معي تصريح ورا العميل انتوا معين زوزو مكان كانوا ولا تستشفى مشكان ضربه
اسمع يش
ايه مطار ايش 20 אנשים עליך
אני יש אומר לך אני בלבד אני לא ايش عاد ضحوا ولا سوق هذا غير
حجم مسخمك المطوصة عني القعود معنا نمر
بداية للمواجهات بين الفلسطينيين حيث نتواجد في باب العمود والأجهزة الأمنية الإسرائيلية. قبل قليل كانت عملية إطلاق لقنابل الصوت وكان بدورهم هناك إطلاق لقارورات المياه صوب الحرس الحدود المتواجدين هنا عند باب العمود. التواصل كما في كل ليلة في هذا الوقت تحديدا يبدأ هنا ويستمر لفترات متأخرة من المساء. هناك أيضا أمرنا بوجود مواجهات قبل خروجنا في هذا البث في حي الشيخ جراح بين الفلسطينيين المتواجدين في الحي بشكل تضامني مع سكان الحي وحرس الحدود أيضا. في داخل المسجد الأقصى تمت صلاة التراويح بهدوء. حتى هذه اللحظة لم نبلغ بمواجهات داخل المسجد الأقصى، ولكن في حال هناك كما تفضلنا هناك توتر قابل للتصعيد. كما قلنا في بث سابق التوتر داخل الاراضي 48 في هذه المدن بالتوازي، يعني في الوقت وخطوط الصواريخ التي تطلق من قطاع غزه والتوتر ما بين الاسرائيليين والقطاع بشكل كبير جدا. وقد تشكل خطوره على اعتبار ان هناك مدن مختلطه وهناك يعيش فيها اليهود والفلسطينيين. ابدا بمدينه القدس تشكل مواجهه فلسطينيه من وسائل الاعلام الاسرائيليه وسيد الرجال في هذه الاحداث. هناك مواجهات، هناك اصابات، هناك اشتباكات مسلحه، هناك عمليه محاوله اختراق احد الجوامع من قبل اليهود في المدينه، حيث بادر العدد من الشبان من مدينه القدس بدعوه توجيه دعوات للتوجه الى الجامع من اجل حمايته ومنع اليهود من اخراقه. هناك ايضا اعتداء من قبل اعداد كبيره من اليهود على مطاعم ذات
ولا الوضع جاء
هناك اصابات خطيره في مدينه عكا بالرصاص لمستوطن وايضا فلسطيني. هذه الاوضاع في داخل اراضي 48 تشكل عاملا ضاغطا على الاسرائيليه وعلى المؤسسه الامنيه الاسرائيليه، على اعتبار ان هذا الوقت بالذات هناك ضغط كبير ليس فقط في الداخل ولكن هناك قطاع غزه الصواريخ التي تطلق، وحتى المواجهات التي تحدث هنا عند باب العمود وحي الشيخ جراح وداخل المسجد الاقصى كلها عوامل ضغط تشكل على المؤسستين العسكريه والامنيه. يعني التدخل الامريكي الحالي قد يشكل ايضا من كان نتنياهو يحاول جعل هذا التدخل لصالح الاسرائيليه او لصالح الاسرائيلي، لكنه ايضا هو في صالح الفلسطيني. هذا التدخل الامريكي سيكون مع الطرف الاسرائيلي ومع من سيكون من الطرف الفلسطيني، هل سيكون في غزه مع حركه حماس والجهاد الاسلامي ام سيكون التدخل مع القضيه مع السلطه الفلسطينيه في اطلاق الحرب. هذه نقطه غايه في الاهميه، واعتقد ان الاسرائيليين يشعرون بالقلق من هذه القضيه مع من ستتحاور الولايات المتحده في مساله التهدئه من الجانب الفلسطيني، مساله الدخول على الامريكي على الخط والتعاطي مع الفلسطينيين تحديدا في قطاع غزه سيغير كما قلت سابقا الكثير من الحرب السياسيه والمواجهه القادمه على الصعيد ليس الاسرائيلي ولكن على الصعيد الفلسطيني. سنرى مع من سيتم التعامل امريكيا مع الجانب الفلسطيني. يعني لماذا رفض نتنياهو التهدئه اليوم؟ لانه يشعر بنشوه الناصر بعد اغتيال 16 من قيادي حركه حماس، 6 منهم من القياديين في الصف الاول في الجناح العسكري، هو يشعر بانه انتصر. هذه القضيه ستعطي دفعه للاستمرار في العمليه العسكريه، وهذا ما فرض عليه الكابينت الاسرائيلي بشكل رسمي بحسب الصحافه الاسرائيليه. تمت المصادقه على الاستمرار في العمليه العسكريه وتمديدها لمده اسبوع قادم. ما الذي سيحدث في هذا الاسبوع 7 ايام قادمه امامنا؟ ما الذي سيحدث؟ ما هو شكل المواجهه او المواجهات او العمليه العسكريه التي ستتخذها الاداره او المؤسسه الامنيه والعسكريه في اسرائيل؟ هذه النقطه غير واضحه، ولكن نتنياهو يعلم بان لكل عمليه عسكريه حدود، ويعلم بان مساله اتساع هذه العمليه العسكريه قد تصب في غير صالحه ان اتخذت منحى فقط زياده وارتفاع عدد الضحايا في صفوف الفلسطينيين وسيكون غالبيتهم من المدنيين، وايضا ستزيد من عدد الضغط من قبل الصواريخ التي ستطلق من قطاع غزه باتجاه المستوطنات المحاذيه للقطاع. هو يحاول تسيير الامور في صالحه من اجل الهروب من مساله فشل تشكيل الحكومه ومن اجل تعطيل عمليه تشكيل هذه الحكومه وقطع الطريق على المنافسين لتشكيل هذه الحكومه. ويبدو ان بنيامين قد وقع في وحي هذه الخطه التي يعني تسير على
معاه جريدة حتى الوفيات يعني صحفيين بس يعني الشيء وين ساكن بيت صباح؟ مهندس. طب تعالوا انتم زورونا. تعرفي ابوي انت جابر اسامه. تعالوا علينا عن جد، تعالوا زوروا. في كثير من المواهب، شرفات من الشرفات. شرفات مواهب، لا بصراحة. 050 عن جد جيبي. طب تعالوا زورونا عن جد والله. أنا والله بالعكس بتصل علي بس ما صدقت. بابا لا بس شيء 10 ولا شيء هذه بدرجة أنا ما لا ولا شيء تمام. لا ما ضربت ولا شيء ولا شيء. لا هاني بحكي معك. يلا واحد كله تمام كله تمام يلا. اللي مروح انا معاك. يلا باي. ان شاء الله بيجي الناس. انا مستشار عادي شغلي اكثر يعني كل جزء من البزنس. انا برجع فيها 15 بعد برجع فيها زمان لا تصير بعد انا عارف شغلي غير عن شغلك. شغلي لازم كثير تعرف تخلي جوازك تناول المصاري.
يلا كل عام وانتم بخير. استنى يا مصطفى. شوف جدا.
السيارة لا في الطريق